Well, it is a great day. I hope you're ready to hear from the Lord a little bit. I wouldn't be able to just jump in without, the solid dad joke has to happen. And I think I found that some of you struggle understanding the dad joke. So today I wanted to help illustrate a success in my life. So this week I went and I purchased a step ladder. I confess I've never really known my real ladder. And Tracy gets to go home with me. That's what's cool. If you have a copy of God's Word, whether in paper or on your phone, would you open it to the book of Matthew, chapter 10? We started a journey last week called Beyond the Bleachers, and I want us to go a little bit deeper today than where we started last week. In this journey that we call our Christian walk, I need to remind you today that our Christian walk is not a spectator sport. It's not that at all. In fact, it's really full contact. If we're transparent, every one of us, as we're walking out our lives with Christ, there's days we get home at the end of the day and we're tired, we're exhausted, we're disappointed, we feel betrayed, we feel forgotten, we feel lost, we feel like God's not involved, we feel like we can't go another day. It's full contact, and we feel it in our bodies, and we feel it in our spirit. And this life of walking with Christ is not designed to sit in the bleachers and escape any kind of discomfort. No, it's quite the opposite. This walk with Christ is a call to be fully engaged in all of the most mortal of combats. Today I want to challenge us. Last week we did talk about part one of stepping out of the bleachers is the essentials, we'll call it. To be present. You need to be part of a church. You need to attend. You need to be consistent in that community. And secondly, you need to be generous. We all need to be generous in our time and in our words and in our finances. And that's getting out of the bleachers. And then you need to find a place to serve. There's ample places to serve here at City Church. In fact, can we just take a minute? Can we thank the guys that stand out in the heat and welcome us every day? What are you kidding me? Those guys, they're warriors. Like, I would cry if I had to do that. So we need to be present. We need to be generous. We need to find a place to serve. And that essentially gets us out of the bleachers. But today, I hope that we can go a little bit deeper in this. If you're open to Matthew chapter 10, will you stand with me, please? We're going to read two verses. Matthew chapter 10, verse 1. Jesus called his 12 disciples together and gave them authority to cast out evil spirits and to heal every kind of disease and illness. Here are the names of the 12 apostles. Jesus, right now, I thank you for your word. I thank you for its truth. I thank you for its depth. I thank you that it's flawless. And today, Holy Spirit, may your voice be louder than mine. Holy Spirit, any piece of what I've put on paper or in my mind that isn't from you, remove it. Lord, I pray that today you are the loudest voice we hear. You are the greatest encourager that we can carry. Lord, I pray that we leave here today more equipped than when we came to influence every person we meet towards your kingdom. And all City Church said, amen. You may be seated. There is a big difference between a fan and a follower. There's a significant difference. A fan sits in the bleachers. A fan knows the names of the team. The players of the team. The fan knows the team colors, and one one weekend might be a whiteout, and so they wear their white jersey, and there's the blackout, and they wear their black jersey, and a fan knows their team's records, and a fan knows that they would be a better coach than the current coach. And a fan knows that they can make better decisions, and yet that fan never ever steps on the field. That fan uses terms like we won, we lost, we drafted the right guy, we made the right decision. Can I just let you know, Kevin, you're not in the decisions. I promise you that whatever franchise you follow is not in their executive boardroom wondering what you think about their decisions. Because it's not we, but we act like it is. And we never have stepped on the field. We're comfortable with our reserve seat tickets. I think that we do the same in our Christian walk. We know the songs. We read the Bible. We attend church. We smile. We tithe. We have a great moral compass. But we never follow Jesus. And the truth is, Jesus didn't die and rise again for an audience. He came to make disciples. And that calling to be a disciple has to bring us out of the bleachers. We read in Matthew chapter 10 that Jesus assembled his disciples. And it's important we grasp this. That the assembly of us even being here is so important. And why is that a key word? If I were to order all of the components, all the parts that make up an airplane and have them in my garage, technically I could say I own an airplane. But it's not assembled. It's gathered, but it's not assembled. And until the engine is put where it belongs, and the wings where they belong, and the windows where they belong, and the wheels where they belong, and the luggage compartment where it belongs, and the bathrooms where they belong, until it's assembled, it's no use. It just sits in the bleachers. Jesus calls his disciples, and then there's a transition. He sends his apostles, and we're going to come back and land on that word apostle. But first, before we can go there, we need to understand truly what a disciple is. And a disciple is a learner. A disciple is a student. A learner is one that is asking questions and curiosity. And you ask any educator, and there's whatever class they're teaching, there's learners, and then there's not. And a disciple is a learner, but a true disciple doesn't just listen. A true disciple arranges their life around the teacher. Whatever your walk of life is, your career, your dreams, your desires, your genre, whatever that is, if we were to bring and introduce to you the leader of the leaders of that part of the world, and they were going to coach you and teach you how to succeed in that specific sport or career, we would rearrange our lives. But we aren't so quick to do it for Jesus. Let me just show you something that we're good at. Can I just throw a jab early, and by the time I'm done, you'll forgive me? So I heard do it over here, and over here I heard, So, I'll just talk to these people. If you need an appointment with your doctor, you set your schedule. Whatever it takes to get into your doctor. Appointment with your lawyer, you change your schedule. Appointment with your accountant, you will change your schedule. But if you want to meet with your pastor, we can only meet Thursdays after 7. I'll let that land. A disciple changes their life. They don't just listen. They don't just learn. They change their life to be around them. A disciple stays close to Jesus until the Christ-likeness starts coming out. And it's a continual coming out. Let me say it this way. Discipleship is not a 6-month program with a graduation date. You never graduate from following Jesus. Simply put, discipleship is becoming the kind of person who lives like Jesus did. I don't know about you, but I'm not really good at that. But we live in a world that tries to offer us so much more. We live in a world that says, be a Kardashian, make millions, start your own product line, get lots of followers, own the finest of the finest, get lipo lifted and tucked, get your Armani and your Gucci. Then you'll be somebody, and we exhaust ourselves chasing a life that we perceive somebody else has at the expense of living the abundant life that's promised to each of us. Jesus himself said that we could have abundant life. And I, quite honestly, I've never really done a deep dive onto the real definition of that word abundant. I think if I just said explain abundant to me, we would all have some piece of definition. Well, it means that we have a lot, or an overflow, or extravagance. Abundant is more than I can contain. I think we all those terms would come out, and they would all be accurate. Those are all parts of abundant. But the depth, the real truth of Jesus' abundant is when you live the abundant life, you're not just affecting this one, you're affecting the eternal one. It's that abundant. It's that kind of overflow. It's not overflow, my bank account is too big. It's overflow. What I'm doing now is making the kingdom a better place for me to be. That's abundant life. John himself declared, whoever has the Son has life. And that word life is not the time that we spend on this planet. Whoever has the Son has eternal life. The Apostle Paul said that we were once dead, and he raised us back to life. We have life available to us, and far too often in our gospel walk, we're content to sit in the bleachers and not take that life to influence those people around us. Every one of us in this room has someone in their life that needs the life that's inside of you. There's someone hurting, someone lost, someone broken, someone disappointed, someone fearful. There's someone in each of our lives that needs to know you have the abundant life, and it needs to be given to them, and you can't if you sit in the bleachers. Jesus didn't come to make sure, just merely so to make sure that you die forgiven. No, he came to make sure that you become fully the person he designed you to be. And the gospel doesn't, the gospel, the purity of the gospel doesn't just promise us someday. It doesn't promise, well, in the sweet by and by, one day when we're sitting on clouds, playing our harp, wearing our Depends. It's life today. Today. So how do we get there? That's a fair question. What are some steps, Pastor? Help me get out of bleachers. How do I get changed by Jesus? I think if I asked that question, again, there'd be some answers, and none of them would be wrong. How do we get changed by Jesus? Well, I spend more time reading. Well, I get to church. I'm part of a small group. I listen to worship music. I stop watching what I used to watch. And all of those are helpful in us becoming like Jesus, but those are all byproducts of the real key to being like Jesus. We miss the simplicity of what Jesus said to us. Listen to what he says in Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all who are weary, all who are weary, all who are burdened, I'll give you rest. That's key, it's important. I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. And I think, at least in my circles, we get stuck on that yoke part. Well, I'm going to take the yoke of Jesus. I know that the yoke takes 2 oxen, puts them together, and the older oxen teaches the younger oxen. I'm carrying the yoke of Jesus. But we miss what he says at the end of that. The simplicity of this message. Learn from me. If you learn from me,
you'll have a desire to spend more time here. If you learn from me, church is a beautiful place to be. It's the bride. If you learn from me, my yoke is easy. How do we learn from him? He says, come to me. Walk with me. Become like me. We miss so much in that verse. He says, when you learn from me, you'll learn my pace. And my pace brings rest. Do you know Jesus never ran anywhere? We don't read about him running. He spent his life walking. He lived life 3.5 miles an hour. And yet never found himself anxious, stirred up, lost. How am I going to get it? And he says to us, learn from me. Jesus' mandate was never watch me. His mandate was follow me. And we sometimes think that, well, forgiveness is the end. I'm finally there, I'm forgiven. No, that's the beginning of discipleship. The evidence of discipleship is there's some transformation, there's some change, there's some behavior, there's a way I treat people changes, there's a way that I think, the way that I forgive, the way that I do life, there's change. We as Christians, let's be honest, we as Christians, we don't like change. We don't like change. We like it when other people change. But we don't like it when we change. Let me prove to you how much we don't like change. On Sundays, you sit in the same chair every week. And it ticks you off when somebody gets here first and sits in your chair. It's like, are you, Holy Spirit is not going to find me 3 chairs down? You ever tried to define change? Well, my behavior is different. Yeah? Is it good or is it bad? Let me give you the simplest definition of change. Change isn't change until your change changes somebody else. That's change. And if your following Jesus hasn't changed your direction, then I wonder what you're really following. Who are you really learning from? I dare say if the struggles that you have today, the internal struggles that you have today, match the internal struggles you had a year ago, I'm not sure you're following someone that's in victory. I think you're becoming a victim. And by the way, discipleship doesn't mean perfection. I want to make that clear. Discipleship does not mean perfection. That's why the purest definition is a learner. We're learning. We're learning how to be what this is. We're learning how to be transformed. We're learning how to stop looking like I used to and look more like him. It's not about perfection. It's about transformation. And grace is so good as grace meets us exactly where we are, but grace loves us too much to leave us there. Let me be really, really clear on this. Salvation, forgiveness, grace is available to all. There is no one that has sinned too much. There is no one that has never believed too much. There is no one that has been poorly faithful too much. The kingdom, the response, the availability of grace is always there. It's that good and it's that freeing and it's that much liberty. But discipleship is non-negotiable. Jesus welcomes us to the throne, but then expects us to surrender. Here's the truth, though. We want Jesus to be our Savior, yet we need to be his life coach. And the truth is, you can't follow Jesus and insist on being in the lead. That's not discipleship. That's not life change. In fact, let me say this. If the gospel that we carry is nothing more than a message that I deliver, and it doesn't get me out of the bleachers, then all that makes us is spiritual mailmen. You know what's interesting about mailmen? There is none of us in this room, I promise you, none of us in this room have ever wondered about the character of our mailman. We just want the delivery. In fact, in all of my life, Stephen, I don't know about you, but in my life, I've never met one person had a childhood dream. One day, I'm going to be a mailman. I can't wait to deliver all the garbage mail. One day, I'm the mailman. But that's what we do. We've been given this gospel that changes lives, that impacts lives, that brings hope, that brings courage, that brings strength. We have a responsibility to get out of the bleachers and share it. We've got to stop being like the parents who think they know best of what's going on the floor. We've got to stop being like the guy who thinks he's a better official than the officials that are on the floor. We even do this. You go to an athletic event, and you'll have your tickets, and you'll sit in your place, and you'll notice that partway through the game that there's some open seats further down. You can get closer to the field. So you get down and sit closer to the field. Now you really feel like you have the right to tell that coach what he should do. We got closer, but we never got on the field. We never let our change become the witness. So we're called and we're empowered, and then we're commissioned. We read in Matthew 10 that Jesus, he assembled his disciples and he gave them authority, and then it says he sent apostles. There's a change there. Called his disciples, empowered them, sent apostles. It's important that we don't miss that small switch. In antiquity, in Jesus' day, that word apostle was not a Hebrew word. That was a Latin word. It came from the Roman world. And in the Roman world, in that day, as the Romans were taking over the known world, they would go into existing communities and they would change the economic system of the community. They would change the monetary system. They would change the educational system. They would change the governmental system. They would even, the Roman road, they would even change the geography of the city. But they realized that the people in the city weren't acting like Romans. So they created an office called an apostle. And the apostle's job was to go into those communities and to make that community look like the kingdom that sent them, with all the resources of that kingdom available. Jesus says to us, your discipleship is I empower you, but now I need you to be apostles and go make your area look like the kingdom that sent you. Get out of the bleachers. If all that we contain, listen, and we're so good at this, all that we take in, we go to one more conference, we take one more class, we read one more book, we've got bookshelves of Christian books and self-help books, and how to be a better spouse book, and how to be a better parent book, and we've been to all the conferences. We have 3 ring binders lined up for the last 9 years. We haven't opened since the last conference. We consume this information, and really all we are is spiritual hoarders. I don't know if you've ever been in the home of a true hoarder. A true hoarder. In part of our ministry in Montana, we helped a lady in the Department of Family Services, engaged us, and we went, and she was the true hoarder. It was really, honestly, it's my only experience with true hoarding. And we walked in her house, and it was so complicated. You didn't even know where to walk. In fact, you couldn't walk, and you had to ask questions about where does she cook, and how does she bathe, and where does she sleep, and does she not see what this is, and what's valuable and what's not valuable? What should we keep and what shouldn't we keep? And honestly, it was one of the most confusing. I didn't know how to, and then how do I help this person depart or release what obviously was important to them, and it was just hoarding, keep. And I feel like in our Christian walks, we're really good at hoarding the information and hoarding the promise and hoarding the hope and hoarding the courage. And there's people around us that come to us and they go, we don't even know what's important to you. Can we go from being called to being empowered and being apostles? Eventually, class has to dismiss. Eventually, the huddle has to break. Eventually, you have to take the field. Next week, I'm very excited for next Sunday, and one of the reasons I'm very excited about next Sunday is the Ottawa football team will be joining us in service. And the Ottawa football team has about 250 on their roster. So we'll have about 250 football players here next week. I'm so excited about that. I'm so excited. But you know what those boys did? They moved from home to be on the field. They work out in the heat to be on the field. They wear a specific uniform to be on the field. They changed their lives to listen to Coach Murphy so they could be on the field. They're not just football hoarders. They're out of the bleachers. Jesus didn't train disciples to occupy seats, by the way. He trained us to invade the darkness. And we're not supposed to sit around and discuss our authority. He didn't give us authority just to talk about authority. He gave us, our authority was not given to us so that we can have status. Our authority was given to us so we can accomplish our assignment. I wrote this morning, reviewing my message, here's a separating question. A fan asks, what can I gain? An apostle asks, where can I go? At some point, you got to get in the game. You can't change the score from the bleachers. David, if you'll come up, let me conclude with this. There's two women, Ruby Eliason and Laura Edwards. Ruby spent her life never marrying, but she was a nurse and spent her life in the medical field. Laura Edwards was a physician, and in her mid-60s, her husband passed away. Ruby and Laura knew each other from the medical field that they worked in, and so at near 70, they decided that they were going to go and make a difference with the gospel through their gifting of medicine. They moved to Cameroon, West Africa, and they began to serve the people in the villages in that area. And they did that well into their 80s. Ruby and Laura, in the year 2000, were in their car, and unfortunately the brakes failed, and the car went off a cliff, and they both died. We might call that a tragedy. This couple who society said, you're done. This couple who said there's really no more place or use for you. This couple that had the sense of loss of widowhood and never really having family. This couple of women who spent their 20 years serving Cameroon and then died, and we might call that a tragedy. I don't call that a tragedy when I look at the contrast, because in that same year there was a couple, Bob and Penny. I won't say their last name, but Bob and Penny had dreamt their whole life that they would be able to retire early. And upon their early retirement, they could move to Punta Gorda, Florida. They could buy a boat, play softball, and collect seashells for the rest of their lives. Inherently, there's nothing wrong with retirement, boats, softball, or seashells. The tragedy is when we face the Lord and all we have to offer is our seashell collection. Now that's the tragedy. That my life can be summed up in a box of seashells. Because I didn't get out of the bleachers. Ruby and Laura, which, by the way, I did as much as I could this week to try to find pictures of them, images of them. I searched, went to different resources. They deliberately kept themselves from being placed in any social environment that would give them any acknowledgement. You cannot find a picture of them anywhere on the internet. Their closest friend, a guy named John Piper, wrote their story. And I read his. You know what they're going to do? They're going to present to the Lord the wounds of the people they treated. They're going to present to the Lord the people that they served in different ways. They're going to present to the Lord the villages that they visited. They're going to present to the Lord the gospel that they carried. They're going to present to the Lord lives poured out. They're going to present to the Lord their own betrayals and brokenness, pain. They're going to be able to say, we got out of the bleachers. I would say their deaths are heartbreaking, but I wouldn't call it tragic. I think the tragedy is when we stay in the bleachers and don't influence other lives with the good news of the gospel. I'd like you to stand with me, please. I wonder what Jesus has placed inside of you, and you're still sitting in the bleachers. Prayer team, if you'll prepare. I'm going to ask if you would do me a favor, if you would, right where you are, bow your head, close your eyes, and even in this moment, would you place your hand on your heart? Place your hand on your heart. In this moment, with your hand on your heart, in the sincerity of this day, will you ask Jesus right now? Just ask him. Lord, where have I been sitting in the bleachers? I'm going to let that land a minute. Lord, where have I been sitting in the bleachers? Next question, with your hand on your heart, and in this moment, will you ask, Lord, what excuses have I made to sit in the bleachers? And then finally, will you ask him, Lord, will you commission me to get out of the bleachers? Will you give me that fresh commission? I'm going to ask the band to take us through one more song, and please remain. Pastor Katie will dismiss us in a moment. Please don't create a distraction right now. But in this next song, will you dive into those questions? Lord, where have I stayed in the bleachers? And what excuses have I made? And will you give me a fresh commission? And during the song, please, some of y'all need to step out and come forward and get prayer. Some of you I know each week you need prayer, and you still choose to leave without having someone agree with you or look you in the eye or let you know you're seen, that they believe in you and they want to encourage you and be a part of your journey. And this amazing group of people every week comes and says, we want to just invest in you. Will you, during the next song, will you ask those three questions? Will you pray into those? Lord, Where am I still in the bleachers? Lord, what excuses have I made? And Lord, will you commission me? And perhaps come get prayer, get agreement with someone to take your next step and not fall back into something that has kept you from getting out of the bleachers. David?